And so I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. John Patrick. He was trained in London and for 20 years was assistant professor of clinical nutrition in the Department of Biochemistry and Pediatrics at the University of Ottawa. He researched the treatment of pediatric nutritional deficiency and used his knowledge in Central Africa in training programs for managing malnutrition. Now he lectures throughout the world on ethical issues in medicine and the relevance of faith to science. And he also heads up Augustine College. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. John Patrick.
Thank you. Unlike you, I never had the privilege of knowing David, but what I've learnt about him makes me wish I had. We have one thing in common. I've been in Burundi too, and Africa has had the same impact on our family that it had on him. We spent more time across the lake in Zaire, now the non-democratic Democratic Republic of Congo, than in Burundi. But that area of the world has certainly had a huge transformative effect on us, as it did on him. And on medical students too, because one of the most interesting things I ended up doing with medical students, against my will, as is usually the way, because I always wished to be purely an ivory tower professor, my deal with the dean over the years was I wouldn't bother him with any desires for promotion or anything of the sort, as long as I could go to Africa for 2 months in the summer and I didn't have to go to committees. And I got away with that deal. I recommend it, because all you get for promotion is responsibility, which I didn't want. But I took a sabbatical in Central Africa because some friends of ours said they needed our help. I had been privileged to have a personal fellowship from the Wellcome Trust for many years to study severe malnutrition with John Waterlow in the West Indies, and in fact was privileged to be part of the group that put the whole protocol together in the end, which is a great privilege. And these missionaries discovered that I knew as much as anyone else in the world at that point about the treatment of severe malnutrition and said, please, will you come and help us? And I said, in principle, yes, and under my breath, in practice, no. But my wife and children said, in practice, yes. And I lost. We went to Africa. And when we came back, of course, after a year, the students wanted a talk, and Sally had taken pictures, so we gave a talk. And then the class feminist and a girl who told me afterwards that she was a lapsed Catholic who took her faith out occasionally, once or twice a year, came and said, will you take us to Africa with you? And I said, I don't know that I'm going back. And they said, your wife is. And she was. And so I said, what would you do for me? And they said, anything you want us to. And I was intrigued by the recognition that the prevalence of malnutrition in that area of the world varied by village quite clearly. And I wanted to know what it was about the villages that made the difference. Because nobody has ever run a successful nutrition education program in sub-Saharan Africa. All the science that we have done, I mean, by the time I left Jamaica in the late 70s, we went through 100 £10 2-year-olds and saved every single one. But there's still not been a successful nutrition education program in sub-Saharan Africa if you put into the evaluation the removal of all expatriate input for 2 or 3 years before you evaluate, which must be a minimal measurement of enculturation. And I wanted to know why. I couldn't understand that. So I needed careful surveys of villages, and students were ideal for that. So I started taking preclinical students to Africa. We took about 40 over the years. And I called it my medical student abuse program because they volunteered, so it was all right. They were first and second year students, preclinical. I would introduce them to the theory of the treatment of malnutrition in Canada, and then when we got there, they'd do their first ward round. A little different from anything they would get here. They rarely got all the way round before turning green and moving out, because the ward in Nundu had every infectious disease known to man pretty well, except sleeping sickness, fortunately. And certainly 2 or 3 children to the cot was the norm. The next day, we set off, and I walked for a day or two into the bush with them. and dropped them in 3s and 4s in villages that I had chosen for them, and left them there for 5 weeks. I didn't stay there. And they had to do a health survey of the village and find and resuscitate 2 malnourished children. It had an immense impact on them. I didn't look for Christians in particular, because Christians, when they come to university, are often in revolt against their background, and so they're a bit of a pain at that stage. So I prefer them to get over that before I do anything with them. So I was much more interested in the students we get in first year, who come wonderfully idealistic and wonderfully energetic, and then in 4 or 5 years we turn them really into cynics. That's a problem. I had quite a lot of students over the years come to me just after they'd started clinical medicine and come to my office and sit down and say, am I going to become like them? And that's a serious question, which any dean or administrators of medical schools have to think about. But in this particular students that I took to Africa, the very first one, the village that we went to, just across the water from Burundi, where David was, no white people other than my family had been in that village for quite a while, and certainly no white people had stayed in that village for 5 weeks, as these young people were going to do. And so we'd walk through the rainforest for several hours. We came out of the rainforest into the village at about 4 in the afternoon, and it was a Saturday, and the village was very excited that we were going to be there, and they'd arranged a feast. So the first thing these girls were introduced to is how you do a feast, African style. They brought the goat in and cut its throat right there in front of them so that they knew it was fresh meat. It didn't come in a plastic bag. And a few hours later they fed us. Now, being honoured guests, we had all the best meat, and having done their anatomy, they recognised it. Heart, liver, thymus, pancreas, brain, everything except what we call meat, which is just for the hoi polloi. All covered with what we used to make soap, palm oil, and there was some dried fish, which we'd seen covered with flies when we came in, and some rice and some bananas. The girls, it was 3 girls in this village, ate the rice and the bananas. Fortunately, my son was with me, and we're Europeans, so we eat organ meats. Not brain anymore, but at that stage we still did. And a few hours, a little while later, the Africans who don't eat with you in this particular tribe came to clear away, and they were obviously a little bit upset that we had eaten so little. They sang beautifully, we sang badly, and we went to bed. Well, the next morning was Sunday morning. Now, they knew that we eat breakfast, but they don't. So since we hadn't eaten it the night before, they served it up again on the equator with no refrigeration overnight. At this point, the 3 girls were in tears. Fortunately, 2 of them were Christians, so I could tease them at least. And I said, this is where you want to go home, don't you? And they tearfully said, yes. And I said, that's tough, because you can't afford the fee to change your ticket, even if you could, and you're too far away anyway. So here's where you put your faith on the line. You better read the last chapter of Philippians, and then we'll pray together. Now, the 3rd girl was the lapsed Catholic girl, and she said, I'm going to pray too. In desperate circumstances, almost everyone does. And the last chapter of Philippians, of course, was chosen with malice aforethought, because it's St. Paul contemplating having his head chopped off and saying, I've learned in whatever state I am to be content, which is what they needed to do at that point. So after 5 minutes or so, we met in this mud hut. 5 of us, my son, myself, and these 3 girls, and we started to pray. Prosaic Protestant prayers. We're not very good at eloquence under these circumstances. But suddenly Julie started to pray. It wasn't praying in tongues, but it was very rapid French, but easy to interpret. Basically, it was, Lord, help. And here was where this ivory tower scientist was stopped in his tracks, because something happened for which I had no explanation. The whole room suddenly became filled with joy. We were all in tears, we were all hugging one another, breaking the University of Ottawa's harassment guidelines. And after a few moments, we calmed down, and Julie said, I don't know why, but I'm not frightened anymore. Neither was anyone else. And the head man of the village had known me for several years, And he had asked me to preach that Sunday morning. And Julie quite rightly said, "You're going to preach this morning in not very good French. It would be better if you did it in English." And I translated to French, and then they went to the tribal language. It would take a little longer, but it would be better. I said, "It would. Are you willing to do that?" And she said, "Yes." So church lasted about 3 hours that Sunday morning. And when we got back to their mud hut, there was one African waiting for them. And he had noticed that these girls had eaten every piece of fruit they'd been offered. And while we were in church, he had gathered all the indigenous fruits of the area. And there they were in a bowl on the table. And he said to them, "I'm going to look after you. What you like to eat, what you not like to eat. I want to see that you have a good time." They had a wonderful time. Julie, up till that point, had been the kind of student that some of you know, who had worried about every exam all along the way, almost to a paralytic extent. That anxiety disappeared that morning, never came back. Now, I don't know any neurochemical explanation of that. Surely her neurochemistry changed, but that's not an explanation, is it? It's just shifting the description to a different level. And it's explanation, ultimately, that we want. And that's what I was asked to talk about tonight. The death of David, for science, is just brute facts. But it's not for you, is it, or for me even? Our response to those kinds of events are not brute facts. There's the deep, anxious, in fact, heart-wrenching desire for meaning and for purpose. How could this be? What is this all about? It's not easy to answer those questions. I get asked to do this not infrequently. You probably remember a few years ago when 30 or so students were shot at Virginia Tech one day, and my wife said to me the week before that, "Very strange that next week you have nothing to do in terms of lectures anywhere else. That's very unusual at this time of year." The day after the shooting, there was a telephone call from a physician there who said, "We're having all these grief counsellors. They're not helping. Are you by any chance available?" I said, "Actually, I am." He said, "Get on the next plane." I had a wonderful time there. Because, of course, for the atheist or for the agnostic, yes, and for the Christian, suffering is a huge problem, but it's a different sort of problem for each group. Lewis, perhaps, explains the way we really need to think about it. He, for many years, maintained his atheistic position because of the nature of the world. How can I believe in a God who would make a world like this one? And then, being the man he was and being intellectually honest, one day he said, "But where on earth did I get the idea that it could be any other sort of world? But from the God I don't wish to believe in." And that was the turning point for him, or one of them. The other one, of course, was that he was set up, because when he did his second degree at Oxford, how long does it take you students to decide who is the brightest student in a PBL group? 2 minutes, right? If there's a really bright one, that's the case. A few years ago in Ottawa, after the first week in medical school, it was competition for third place. The first two had gone, and everybody knew it. We can pick those things up very fast. Well, Lewis was set up because in that small Oxford tutorial group, there were 3 people who were going to have a major impact on how we think about Christianity in Britain. He was one of them, of course, but he didn't know it at that point. Now, he moved from atheism to theism for purely rational reasons. And obviously this is happening with increasing frequency. I mean, when Anthony Flew, at the end of his life, having been the doyen of atheistic philosophers when I was at King's, says at the end of his life, "I can't believe that anymore. It's just too complex what's turning up in the area of molecular biology." And since Flew converted, it's only got worse, hasn't it? I remember the first time, well, not the first time, I remember when what was then called the double reading frame in mitochondrial DNA was worked out. One of the guys in our department was working on it. Many of you know the problem, some of you don't. But for those who are not in the science area, I think I can explain it fairly simply. We are all described in a 3 billion long chain of letters that break up into sections, and we can cut them up with chemical scissors. We have markers that enable us to identify where we think a gene begins and ends, and frequently we're right, not always. Lots that used to be called junk DNA is now changing its name. I was always suspicious of junk DNA. How could you even call the packaging of something which would take about 100,000 pages of an encyclopedia to package that information in a meter of DNA that is packaged so well you can't see it? That's not junk packaging, at least, is it? But anyway, from mitochondrial DNA some 15 or 20 years ago, we realized that occasionally you got twice as much protein as you expected from what you thought was your gene. The guy who actually worked it out didn't work it out. He saw it. And this is an important thing to think about. He was in Seattle one night, sitting in his laboratory, looking at his data. He had the strip of DNA that he'd got, and he had the proteins he'd got, 2 of them, out of the same sequence. Both of them worked. How was that done? And then he suddenly saw that there were 2 codons to start off. And you could start that peeling off of the 1,000 or so bases that you need for the average amino acid, both at base number 1 and base number 2. In other words, in the same sequence of letters, there were 2 grammatical sentences, if that's the way you like to look at it, out by 1 letter. To really get it, to imagine it as an ordinary person, think of taking 1,000 letters of Shakespeare from any play you like, including the spaces, and then when you've read that wonderful 1,000 letters, you can go back and shuffle it so that you just move along 1 letter and start at the 2nd letter. And lo and behold, you have another completely poetic language sentence. That's what's present in mitochondrial DNA on occasions. And I'm told, I haven't been doing this stuff for a while, that the amount of DNA that contains more than 1 gene is increasing. This ought to be mind-boggling. I said to the guy who was in our department working on this problem, "What do you make of that?" And he said, "Well, it's there, isn't it? And there's no poetry in the man's soul, no sense of awe. It will come." You know that these things are happening when molecular biologists started making jokes at their own expense, which they are now doing. The one that I particularly like came to me from Francis Collins, where the molecular biologists become so arrogant that they say to God one day, "You know, we make better cells than you now." And God says, "That's an interesting concept. We better have a cell-making competition. They've dug the hole and fallen in, they can't get out." "Next Thursday," says God. Of course, when they get to the laboratory, God's there first. And as they come through the door, he waves his finger. No, 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 bring your own dirt." And of course, Lewis again understood this a long while ago. He said to believe that mind arises from mindlessness, I find very difficult. And I think that's a reasonable question. He said it's rather as though cabbages, as well as resulting from the laws of botany, give lectures on the subject. And it is. So the really interesting thing is to see the arrival of the mathematicians and the philosophers in this area. And it's changing it. I had a marvelous moment along these lines myself some years ago in, of all places, Cuba. I've been to Cuba many times to teach medicine and pediatrics and nutrition, but they also allow me to teach pastors, as long as I don't push the envelope too far. I had a conversation with the Minister of Health on one occasion, explaining to him why he couldn't run a health system. And he asked me to come back, but I haven't been back yet. But he said, just don't push it too hard. I didn't get a visa for a couple of years at one stage because I was still teaching people of this age in a church in one of their cities, I forget which, at midnight on Sunday, and they can't get 20 people out to a Communist Party meeting, but this church was packed. So I had to pay penance for that. But on the occasion I'm thinking of at the moment, I'd given a lecture on science in one form or another, and afterwards a gentleman came up to me, and he said, he introduced himself and said, "I'm the head of the Department of Marxism and Leninism in the local university, and I've heard about you." He said, I have stopped teaching Marxism and Leninism, and I'm trying to teach multicultural ethics, and the students go to sleep. But they tell me they don't go to sleep when you teach ethics. And he went on to explain that he knew, he's quite right, that Russia was not brought down by Reaganomics, but by rotting from the inside. It was an ethical failure. As one student said to me in St. Petersburg, what the Marxists did was to destroy the meaning of the word trust. You can't practice medicine without trust, can you? Because you can't have a referral practice. And since you can't know everything, it's a disaster if you don't have colleagues you trust. And so he said, I want you, if you will, since you're only in this city for one more day, to debate me tomorrow morning in front of the faculty on the nature of human ethics. Now, there's no way I would turn that down. That was just too much fun. Now, I had one evening to think about how one would do that, and to say my prayers, of course, because it was pretty short notice. And I had several ways that I knew would start and work. But I also knew, and this is interesting, that there was a much better way to do it, but I had no idea what it was. But I was quite certain it existed. It wasn't put into my head until I got up from my seat to walk to the lectern to make my presentation the next morning. Fortunately, I had a wonderful Canadian Colombian as my translator, and we talked about what I was going to do. Unfortunately, there's not a blackboard behind me here, or a whiteboard or whatever. And I said, Hugo, the start has just changed. He said, what do you want me to do? And I said, I want you to write on the board, this message assembled itself in Spanish. So he did. And then I asked all these profs and graduate students, if you'd come into the lecture room and found that written on the board, what would you make of it? And they rightly said, well, it's grammatical after a fashion, but it's nonsense, isn't it? This message assembled itself. And then I turned around, I congratulated them on their intelligence, etc., and then I turned around and crossed out the word message and put in DNA. I said, but you do believe this sentence, this DNA assembled itself. But don't you see, all I've done is play language games with you. DNA is not you and me. DNA is a message specifying how to make you and me. And they burst into applause. I'd won the debate because they had lived under scientific materialism for long enough and they knew it didn't work. It is an astonishing problem. Fred Hoyle, the atheist professor of cosmology at Cambridge, used to say this. He was a Yorkshireman after all, very blunt. He said, asking me to believe naive Darwinianism is like expecting me to believe that a hurricane blows through a scrapyard and I get a 747. Frankly, I'm a little credulous of that possibility. That's what he would say, isn't it? But actually, it's much worse than that. The real analogy would be that a hurricane blows through a scrapyard of metal and you get a neatly bound set of working drawings written on paper telling you how to make a 747. That's a much more appropriate analogy. You could play with Lego forever in various ways and you might assemble various things. But from that plastic, you would never get paper with the drawings that are conceptualized in abstract terms on how to make things with those materials. That's the problem. And of course, language at the heart of it all is even more of a problem. Interestingly enough for me in the last year or two, Fodor, who's an atheist, and an Italian guy whose name I can never remember, has written a book called What Darwin Did Not Know. Now, these are two world-class cognitive scientists. And what drove them to do this was they said, in our area, we have given up on Skinner because treating language and learning as a black box actually doesn't work. It's not very useful. Yet, that's exactly what the Darwinians are doing. Now, in the end of the preface, they say, when we showed this book to some of our friends, they said, you can't publish that, it will give comfort to the enemy. That clearly makes it apparent, they said, that they think of this in ideological terms. And we said, frankly, we disagree with you. If it's true, we need to deal with it. If it isn't, then they'll deconstruct it. Good for them. It is a real problem. And it's getting worse. As you know, when my age, and some of you are close to that age, when you started in medical school, one gene, one protein. Now we've got 35,000 proteins from a single gene. That's pretty astonishing, isn't it? Now, I don't know. Evolution obviously occurs. Anybody who denies that is just ignorant at the level of species. Hawaii being the best example. When we went there 150, 200 years ago, there were no fruit flies. Now there are fruit flies in Hawaii that don't interbreed with any others. That's a new species by definition. But it's a long way from species to where we go next. And the sort of stuff that's coming out at the moment is really quite challenging, isn't it? And I can't wait till a really first-class epidemiologist, a first-class mathematician, and a first-class student of language sit down together and work at this. Because at the heart of it all, there's a language. Only needs 4 letters. And yet it can specify you and me in a strip of DNA that we can't see, at least in the way it's packaged within the cell. It's those aspects of science that began to get to me after the years. It was a long while coming, but it did get there in the end. But the real turning points was the recognition that there were aspects of medicine where this simply was not the question that was at stake. And of course, it's getting much worse. But in order to make this more accessible, I want to teach you a little history. The Greeks, Aristotle in particular, thought that to give a decent description of the causation of anything, you needed to consider at least 4 aspects of those things. They're known as Aristotle's 4 causes, and they have fancy names, the formal, the material, the efficient, and the final causes, but you don't even have to try and remember those. This is not medicine, after all. It's not memorize and dump. But just think of a statue, and you've got the basic idea in your head. The statue is made out of something. That's the material cause, say marble. In order to be made, somebody's conception of what is in that block of marble has to operate. Michelangelo famously would say that he liberates what he sees in the block. That's the formal cause of the statue. Now, he brings to it certain skills and tools. Those are the efficient causes. But his motivation for doing the whole thing is to beautify the city. That's its purpose. Now, that way of looking at causation went on for a long while. People like Dawkins give too much credit to the Greeks. They were very good at mathematics, and they were very good at philosophy and logic. But Aristotle's science was not so great. His biology as observation is incredible. I mean, there were things that he observed with the naked eye that were not confirmed until the 19th century. But his way of looking at nature, say in his physics, is very passive, never experimental. And that is because he didn't believe in inductive reasoning. He didn't trust it. He wanted deductive reasoning. So he had to start with what he saw as being self-evident. So he said, obviously, things fall in proportion to their weight. That rather screwed up his physics. All he really needed to do was to go to the nearest cliff and drop 2 stones off of very different weights and observe the fact that they hit the ground at the same time. Never did it. But he was an extremely bright man. And Galen, who followed him, had the same impact on medicine. So the 2 of them between us sort of fossilized us because everybody was afraid to say boo to Aristotle or Galen. And we made virtually no progress for a long, long time. In fact, but then again, we did start making progress at a time which, again, Dawkins et al. Don't notice. It wasn't the Enlightenment that started it all off. It was all underway well before that. At the very latest, you would have to say that it was happening by 1277. 1277 is a convenient date. Now, during that period, in the 12th and 13th centuries, Greek learning had come back over the Pyrenees from Muslim-controlled Spain into France and into Europe. And it came back into the Latin world that way. It had stayed with the Muslims since the Nestorian Christians and the Jews had set up the great library in Baghdad and elsewhere, and some great science had been done. There was only one guy really who tried experiments, Alhazen, And he was so unappreciated that he, at one period of his life, had to feign madness in order not to get executed because he'd failed to achieve something he thought he could achieve. But Avicenna, who wrote the most widely used textbook of medicine of all time, but it wouldn't survive today. Nobody's going to come close to Avicenna over time, but it didn't have the content we needed. That was all going to start. But once that material came over the Pyrenees, the brilliance of Aristotle's logic and his philosophy really began to have an impact. And of course, the great synthesizer was Thomas Aquinas, who put the whole thing together. Now, shortly after his death, the universities were now underway. They began in end of 12th, beginning of 13th century. And of course, they were all entirely Catholic. The people who taught there were largely priests or on their way to being priests, in fact, entirely. And religious people often fear knowledge. They shouldn't, but they do. And that was true of the Catholic Church at that point. They wondered whether what Thomas had done would be misunderstood. And there were some people in the University of Paris who were certainly going way beyond anything Thomas would say, and actually promoting heresy, which also turned out to be bad logic. But nevertheless, Thomas and others were banned briefly, more than once, but the main example was 1277. So you can put yourself in the shoes of those people. If you're an academic yourself, it's rather like the dean calling you and saying in the end of August, by the way, none of your notes from last year can be used for this year's lectures. You must start from scratch. Because they were told not to use Aristotle's deductive logic. What would you do? Miserable thought, isn't it? Go to the pub, probably drown your sorrows. But when they came to, so to speak, they said, well, they said a Christian thing. It's Butterfield who makes this point. They said, well, we as Christians believe that we have a mandate to understand and be the steward of nature. But we've made precious little progress in all the centuries that Christianity has been around so far. Maybe it's because our attempt to use deductive logic from the big idea of God to the particular problems at the bottom level is just too much for our puny brains. But if God is God, and he is a God of order, underneath the surface chaos of life, there must be order. So let's try inductive reasoning. Let's see, if we start with something we can understand and work the other way, what will happen? And of course, despite the attempt by modern liberals to say it's the hypothetico-deductive system, that's not true. It was an inductive system that led to the hypothesis and the deduction. And without induction, we couldn't have gone anywhere. But of course it worked. Now, within 100 years or so, the first graph was being produced in Merton College, Oxford, and they didn't really know what they'd done. It's not really till you get to Galileo, but it's long before the Enlightenment, that it really takes off when Galileo starts rolling a ball down an inclined plane and watching where the ball lands when he changes the angle. That's the beginning of real physics. That was going to put a man on the moon, but he didn't know it. But this had come about because of three people: William of Ockham, René Descartes, and Francis Bacon. And what they had done, Ockham and René Descartes were both deeply committed Christians. Ockham was actually a Franciscan monk, and they were worried, like Christians often are, as I say they shouldn't be, about what the new science was going to do to faith. So they wanted to peel off one area of reality to be outside the realm of science. So they said that things like love and justice and truth were just names. They had no real existence. That's the beginning of nominalism, which leads to reductionism, which is what dominates the Western world currently. You're all being turned into reductionists in one sense or another. It's not all bad by any means. And Bacon added the idea that only the things that could be measured could be done in this way. And that changed the meaning of the word fact. For the ancient world, facts were about love and truth and justice and honor. But once that trio had done their work, if you say to a student now, just give me the facts, doctor, you mean the things that are publicly accessible and no one can deny, largely because they can be measured. But there are two things in those four causes that Aristotle thought were necessary that get lost in that process. When we move from quality to quantity, we lose teleology, purpose, and we lose a proper idea of where ideas come from, because they can't be quantified. And that's a huge problem. It's beginning to be unpacked now. We had a good time at the beginning of science. I mean, the golden age, the 17th century. If you look at the people who are, by all accounts, the most important scientists, you need to realize that all except about 3 of them were not skeptical in any way. They all claimed to be Christian, and half of them were deeply committed, devout Christians. Examples of names you would really know would be people like Boyle, who was an evangelical, like many of you are. Now, that 17th century, of course, was followed by the 18th and 19th, where reductionism really took over. The sort of moment of truth was when Napoleon said to Laplace, when presented with some science, he said to him, "Where does God fit into your science?" And Laplace says, "Sire, I have no need for the hypothesis of God." And that's true. Once it was demonstrated that inductive reasoning works, you don't need to believe in God to do it. But as Butterfield, the professor of the history of science at Cambridge, put it, if Newton had not had his God, he would certainly not have gone looking for his laws. Now, for me, in Central Africa, that turned out to be the key notion too. Because if you believe, as most animist societies, all animist societies do, that the best way to describe life is by reference to evil spirits, then you can never do science, because experiments don't make sense, because evil spirits are local. And don't laugh at evil spirits. Evil spirits are a very good description of the existential problems that people face. And the questions that all your patients have to answer before they die are not quantifiable questions, but qualitative questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? How do I make sense of death and suffering? How can I believe in justice? What can I know? What ought I to believe? Therefore, what ought I to do? None of those are quantifiable. But every one of you has to deal with them before you die in one sense or another, if you're going to be people who can actually face death. In Central Africa, when we went there, and I didn't expect to succeed any more than anyone else, I trained my children, my teenagers, to resuscitate malnourished children, and all my children did that as teenagers. My deal was, you work for me in the summer and I'll pay for your first degree. That was a good deal from them and for me. We have no materialists in the family. They've all seen children die. In most cases, had children die in their arms. It didn't do them any harm. They saved many more. But I was no more capable of making what I knew to be possible to work when I left. I could measure the decline in the program with 9 months' absence. And that was when I began to realize that I was barking up the wrong tree, so to speak. One of the nurses that I had trained to resuscitate these children had his own child die of malnutrition. That was really appalling from my point of view. And I asked him what happened. And he told me he wasn't going to tell me the truth by not looking at me. When he answered, he looked at the ground and said, "We didn't feed him properly." I knew he didn't believe that, because he would have looked me in the face if he did. So I sent my supervisor to find out what he really believed. And of course, he believed that an evil spirit had taken the child's appetite away, so he had used his spare money to hire the witch doctor rather than spend it on food. Now I thought, this is easy. I said to him, if I had fed your child, he would have got better. He said, yes, but you have a stronger spirit. It's very difficult to get inside that story of meaning, because there's precious little evidence of a God of love if you live in Central Africa, with half your children dying before maturity, a third of your tribe being HIV positive and having some of the worst governments in the world around. It takes a considerable amount of faith for a belief in a God of love to emerge in that environment. Amazingly, it does. And then I had another moment of truth. I've got off track. How long have I got left? You're listening, so I'll go on for another minute. Those of you who are busy, like deans, can leave at any moment you wish, you know. my wife was responsible, because very shortly, of course, when you do things that don't work as a scientist, you don't go on repeating an experiment that you know the answer to. I had straightened out the pediatric ward, and it was back to square one when I came back a year later. I knew that although my children could resuscitate the malnourished children, I hadn't penetrated the hearts and minds of the people. Fortunately, I had come to know a man called Bruce Waltke, who's one of North America's best theologians, an Old Testament theologian. And he had taught me something which turned out to be very important. He gave a wonderful series of lectures on covenant. And in it, he said, if you ask a Jew, how is it that Jews win all the Nobel Prizes? Which they do, don't they? I mean, if you look at the real Nobel Prizes, I don't mean the silly ones like peace, but the real ones like physics and biochemistry and medicine, they're won by Jews. They may be British Jews or French Jews or American Jews, but they're dominantly Jewish. An Orthodox Jew will tell you, it's very simple. Go read Deuteronomy 6 and then practice it. They complain that we are not sufficiently morally serious to get to the level we need to get to. I didn't, of course, know what Deuteronomy 6 was, and I suspect many of you don't. But it's the Shema Israel, the central statement of the Jewish religion. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Now, you don't do this in lectures normally, but it's good for students. Anybody brave enough to guess what comes next? None of you? Some of you are thinking, are you not? And your neighbour is yourself, right? But you know I'm out to get you, so you're not going to say it in public. And that's not what comes next. That's in Leviticus 19, the Holiness Code. Usually Jesus quotes Deuteronomy, but on that occasion, it's not. It's Leviticus. Deuteronomy is much more interesting, especially for pedagogues. He goes like this: these things shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, when you sit at table, when you rise up, when you lie down, when you go on a journey. Even goes further, tells you how to do it. When your son, this is further down the chapter, when your son asks you for the reason we do things, meaning in life, don't give him a lecture. Tell him the story. We were slaves in Egypt. God rescued us, brought us through the desert into the promised land. And then you can say, don't you think half a day a week is not unreasonable for a God like that? And he'll say yes. When he gets to 8 or 9, you've taught him to rationalize your desires, and he'll say no. But what happens, you see, Jewish history is unlike any other. They don't pretend that their great heroes were good people. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, 12 times in a row. In other words, Jewish history is the only one in the world which is not morally revisionist. Other people pretend that their leaders were better than they were. The Jews will have none of that nonsense. We're all fallen creatures, or as Isaiah Berlin puts it, no straight thing can be made out of the crooked flesh of humanity, the crooked timber of humanity. It's a lovely metaphor, and it's true. And of course, moral consequence is built into every single one of those stories. Nobody gets away with anything. And that, say the Orthodox Jews, is why we learn more deeply than you do, and therefore why we do better than you. We're not morally serious. And one can see this process developing. We have no idea now, do we, how much of the scientific literature is fabricated. And of course it's very hard to imagine why it wouldn't be fabricated. We're merely reaping the rewards of what we have taught. The problem for an evolutionary view of human beings, of course, is individual altruism. Willie Hamilton got obituaries in both Science and Nature for his statistical account of altruism, but it only describes how groups work, and it doesn't answer the problem. It's an answer that doesn't explain. Because for his model to work, if you're crossing the bridge in Dundee and somebody jumps in to commit suicide, before you jump in to rescue them, you have to do a swift calculus of how many genes you share with the person who's jumped. If it's your twin brother, you don't hesitate at all, but by the time you get to an Outer Mongolian, it's 20 minutes. That produces group altruism, but it's no description of how human beings behave. It's an explanation that doesn't explain. The only reason he got the accolades he did is because, as the atheistic philosopher Nagel puts it, I want to believe there is no God. But he's more honest. He goes on and says, it disturbs me greatly that most of the minds that I admire most in the philosophical world disagree with me. And those of you who are even marginally interested in this, I thoroughly recommend a book that's been published in Britain in the last couple of years by a professor of philosophy from Reading and a fellow of St. John's College, Oxford. It is so beautifully written. It is elegant, it is smart, it is clever, and it's very respectful. It's called Why Believe? John Cottingham. If this is something that matters to you, read about it. He does a wonderful job. But that teaching from Deuteronomy really made me think. And then Bruce Walke had not thought about teach it to your children. I'm a pediatrician. All around the world, children are very interesting in respect to stories. And by asking you a question, I can see very quickly whether you read to children. What is the difference between the response of a 7-year-old and an under 5 to the question, would you like a story? And while you're thinking about it, I'll tell you my answer and watch your face, and I'll know whether you read to children. The 7-year-old will go to her bedroom and bring you the book she's in the middle of. And she will milk you for as many chapters as you will read. They'll even turn off the television for having mum or dad or granddad or granny read a book. But the under 5, even in our house, we have 20 grandchildren, so they have their own shelf. They will go off and bring a book. Now, smartly, they take it to Sally most of the time, because I get bored very easily. And if they do bring it to me, I've read this book a lot of times, so I try and shorten it. Not enough of you read to children. You've missed something important. One of my grandsons said, has Granddad forgotten how to read? You see, they want a word-perfect story. And this is true of every culture I've visited. Typically in an African village, a boy in his early teens will be the official storyteller for the village because he's got memory and understanding. And everybody else will listen to make sure he gets the story right. But the stories vary by culture. Teaching ethics to medical students is largely a waste of time, in my view, because it's too late. It's happened long before that. It's these stories that have happened in their early life that you really need to know about. Now, if the dominant story in a child's life comes from the Old Testament, you will get a Jew with Jewish ethics. If the dominant story comes from the Bible, you get a Christian with Christian ethics. The Quran, a Muslim, the Book of Nature, an animist. And here's the really bad news. If it's television, you get a Western person, particularly an American, with American ethics. But it also applies to Britain. If you don't believe this is true, here's an experiment you can do, and you come from a quasi-experimental faculty. Pollute your mind for an hour or two, writing some clues to the ads that have been on television over the last 3 or 4 years. And then write some clues to the major Bible stories, and go test your 8-year-olds. What's the answer going to be? You know very well what the answer is going to be. Virtually total biblical illiteracy and total knowledge of television advertising. They don't do it because it doesn't work. They do it because it does. They have your head in a database, and they will call you when they want you to buy something. That's the way it works. Wendell Berry's lovely poem, The Mad Farmer Liberation Front, is worth reading. Just Google it, it'll come up. It describes us in a brilliant way. That's where we're at the moment. And of course, as we move further in this direction, it's going to get a little more difficult. If I have a student from China, for instance, who has the money for a master's degree, and it turns out that the project is a lemon, they'll get their MSc for the methodological work to show that you couldn't get the answer that way, but it's not going to be exciting. Nobody's going to notice them. They're not going to get an offer of a PhD. Now they face a dilemma. I can either fabricate some data and publish a paper that will be interesting enough to publish and will get me a PhD offer, perhaps, or I can go back to China. If you believe it's all about a battle of the genes, why wouldn't you fabricate the data? There's no reason, is there? There has to be reason for doing what you're doing. There has to be motivation. Kepler is the classic example. Reworking his data for 5 years by hand, not his data, Tycho Brahe's data, because Brahe was the first person to actually measure the variance in his data so that he knew the answer could not be bigger than this or smaller than that. And the problem, of course, was that Mars appears to go backwards when viewed from the Earth. And when Kepler saw the solution, he didn't work it out, he saw it. He wrote a prayer in his lab book, giving thanks to God for an error of 5 minutes of arc in the movement of Mars. You wouldn't do that if you were a Darwinist. You'd get on with writing the horoscopes with which he actually paid the bills. But he was much more interested in the orbit of Mars. You see, we need motivation. Anybody in teaching knows that. And teaching, in the end, if it's really going to work, also requires purpose. Teleology cannot be lived without. Even in biochemistry now, the ironies are wonderful, aren't they? That what happened with the endarkenment, as I prefer to call it, is that we cut out purpose. But now, when we started into genetics and we get a gene, a sequence that we think is a gene, what do we have to say next? What's it for? What does it do? So we express it, and we get a protein that looks a bit like a ball of wool that a cat's played with at first sight. And we have to say, what does it do? We can't live without teleology, without purpose. And this is where science fails. All the young people, particularly in this room, can live without things that are material, but they cannot live without things that are immaterial. They cannot live without love, fidelity, justice, truth, honor. And those things are not to be derived from science, because science is purely quantitative. It has no means to reach those kinds of conclusions. Now, the person who's done, I think, in my view anyway, the most amazing work for this is Alistair McIntyre. And if you're interested in this, you should read his book, After Virtue. Probably, in my view, one of the greatest philosophical texts written in the last 100 years. And for me, the reason was, of course, that McIntyre began as a Marxist, but he ended as a Thomist. He started in Oxford, he's at Notre Dame now, and will only teach first year. I think he's retired now, but he would only teach first year. He said after first year they're irredeemable, but I might get to them in first year. There aren't many Nobel Prize level teachers who will only teach first year and 400 students, but he could do it, he got to it. The opening of that book, After Virtue, goes like this. It's a parable in the first chapter, first page. He says, I want you to imagine a know-nothing government taking charge. Not difficult for us in Canada to imagine. I imagine not difficult for you either. And they decide that all the problems in the world are due to science and scientists. So, easy solution. Lynch the scientists, blow up the laboratories, burn the libraries, and all will be well. A kind of green people gone mad approach. And, of course, they discover that the world is worse rather than better. So they decide to reinvent science. But they've lost any overarching sense of what it is. All they can do is pull the various facts together and teach them by rote. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Learning facts that you haven't integrated into a proper theoretical structure. And so they do that, and of course it doesn't work. And then what McIntyre says is that this is what I'm proposing to you in this book, but not in relation to science, but in relation to morality. We have lost any overarching sense of what it is. We have no moral consensus. That's obvious, isn't it? Just think of the key issues: abortion, euthanasia, sexuality. We don't need to go any further. There's no possibility of agreement. So if either side enforces the law to get what they want, by definition, the other side will be alienated. So disrespect for the law is the outcome. That, of course, is totally demoralizing, hence drugs and alcohol. And so it goes on. Read Toynbee. I didn't see my first drug addict till I was a physician of 26, I think. It wasn't an issue until then, in the 60s, late 50s. that's where we're at. And MacIntyre goes on then and does an incredible historical discussion of Western history, philosophical history. And at the end, he finishes thus. He says, if you followed my argument, then you ought not to be entirely without hope. The last time we were entering upon a dark ages, it wasn't the end of the world. And the reason is that good men and women withdrew from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium into the task of forming communities within which they could keep the civilities and the virtues alive, and they succeeded. The only difference is, this time, is that last time the barbarians were waiting at the gate, and this time they have been ruling us for quite some time. And it is our failure to appreciate that fact that is at the heart of our problem. We are waiting for a doubtless new St. Benedict. Now, the good news for me is that really smart liberal scholars, like Robert Fogel at the University of Chicago, people like the neo-Marxist philosopher in Germany, whose name escapes me at this moment, are saying that if we don't recognize that the fundamental underpinnings of our society came from religious bases, we're in trouble. Because it's the virtue of trust that is essential to the survival of society. That's good news. The other thing, of course, is that within leading-edge science, it's not PhD piled higher and deeper science, where you cross the T's and dot the I's. But when new advances are made, they are like that guy sitting in his lab in Seattle who saw the solution, or like the famous conversation between Einstein and his friend, Einstein and his friend, and he stopped him in mid-sentence and said, "Thank you," and off he went back to the patent office and wrote 4 papers that changed the world in that year from the patent office in Bern. The person who's written about this best is Polanyi, who was professor first in Manchester and then in Yale, with his concept of tacit knowledge. He said, being provocative, of course, that you know the result of the experiment first. You do it to find out that you're usually wrong. But sometimes you're right. Einstein knew what the answer was, and it turned out when he did the work, it was. The same was true of Newton. And we know this in medicine too, don't we? If I was to take a poll of the people in this medical school as to who is the best surgeon and who is the best internist, I wouldn't get a random scattering of names. It would be 2 or 3 in each case. If I then asked you, how do you know that they're the best surgeon or the best physician? It's not because you've done an outcomes analysis or done a critical review of the literature or anything like that, or done any evidence-based medicine. You know already. And you can rationalize, but you knew first. And how do you measure the fact that when you go in and see the best surgeons at work? From the bureaucrat's point of view, the butcher and the great surgeon get the same fee, so to speak. But you know perfectly well, most people in this city, you wouldn't allow them to do a good many operations on you. A few, you would want to do it. And when they operate, yes, you can rationalize that somehow they seem to find the tissue planes, their blood loss is less, but you knew just by watching. Tacit knowledge is real. It's real in the metaphysical area, it's real in the physical area. We need to start thinking about these things. David clearly, although he left this world very early, had thought about a lot of these. I don't understand why the good Lord took him when he did. But if you love him, do some of the things he was doing. Read outside the box. Be a little more cynical about the way you learn your medicine, because the vast majority of what you learn you're never going to use, because it's just pure fact. I was so cynical. Frankly, I never actually ever went to an orthopedic session of any sort. I never went to a clinic. I never set a fracture. Nobody ever knew. I knew I was useless as a carpenter, so I was not going to do that. I went climbing instead. I recommend it. The dean didn't hear that, and it was off the record. But thank you for listening.